So suppose you're writing a piece of music and you want to change keys. What are some ways to do that? Hi everybody, I'm John, and in this video we're going to go over two kinds of modulation in the chorales of Bach: modulation by common chord and chromatic modulation. So I said this video is going to be about modulation, which is the same thing as changing keys. But before we talk about changing keys, we need to discuss the relationship that proximate keys have to each other. Let's do a brief overview. In an earlier video, I drew a chart that shows that in any given key, be it major or minor, you can transition easily to 5 other keys that are all either one step above or one step below the home key in the circle of fifths. Let's take C major again for our example. From C major, you can go to G major, F major, E minor, or D minor. But the boundaries between these keys are actually not very strict. There are actually a lot of overlap between proximate keys. To demonstrate this, let's write out all the chords for each key in succession. First of all, we should note that because these keys are only one step apart from each other in the circle of fifths at the very most, they share many chords. We call these chords common chords. Note the chords that each of these keys have in common. C major shares 4 chords with G major: C major, E minor, G major, and A minor. C major also shares 4 chords with F major: F major, A minor, C major, and D minor. We could continue this process with all the keys on the graph. Because of all this overlap between keys, the very concept of being in a key in the first place is actually more fluid than you would have thought. And it's easier to slip and slide between keys if you know what you're doing. And there are 2 ways that Bach does this: by common chord modulation and chromatic modulation. Let's go over each of them in turn. Common chord modulation is when you use a chord that is common to both keys to establish a link between them. So let's say you're in C major and you want to transition to G major through a common chord. There's an easy way to do this. You could start on the C major chord and then go from that C major chord to an A minor chord, which is common to both the keys of C major and G major. And next you could proceed to a D major chord, which is the dominant of G major. And from there, you could land on a G major chord, the tonic of G major. All sounds very satisfying, doesn't it? But let's say you want to do something a little more dramatic and expressive. This is where chromatic modulation can come in handy. In chromatic modulation, instead of using a chord that is common to both keys to link them together, we simply skip straight to a chord from the second key. Now in the music of Bach, this is practically always the dominant of the second key. But I should add that that's the way Bach does things. That's the way things are done in common practice music. But in many other styles of music, especially modern music, that's often not the case. Chromatic modulation can be done in a lot of different ways. So once again, let's suppose that we're in C major, starting off on a C major chord, and we want to get to G major and land on a G major chord. How do we do that? Well, actually, the process for doing that looks exactly the same as in the last example, except that we just knock out the common chord between the 2 keys, which in the last example was A minor. And instead, we just go directly from a C major chord to a D major chord, which is the dominant of G major, and then from there to a G major chord. That's one way to do a chromatic modulation. Now, as an aside, I'd like to say that I really like writing chromatic modulations because they give me the option of writing a nice, smooth ascending bass line when I employ first inversion chords. It has a romantic flavor to it that I really enjoy. So now that we've seen what each of these types of modulation looks like, let's find an example of each of them in the chorales of Bach.
Okay, so first let's look at an example of common chord modulation in chorale number 312. In measure 6, Bach comes to a cadence on a D major chord. At the beginning of the next measure, he uses a D major chord as a common chord between D major and A major. The following chord is an E dominant 7th chord, which firmly establishes us in the key of A major. We can find an example of chromatic modulation in chorale number 23. At the beginning of the chorale, we are in A minor, but at the end of the first measure, Bach quickly brings us to G major through a common chord modulation. We cadence on a G major chord on the 3rd beat of the 2nd measure. However, on the 4th beat of the 2nd measure, we suddenly leap from a G major chord to an E major first inversion chord, thus bringing us back to A minor, and we land on an A minor chord on the 1st beat of the next measure. It's quite the dramatic transition, especially with the more than octave leap in the bass.
So those are the 2 ways to modulate from one key to another. I hope you found this video helpful. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.